Hello there, programmers, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about answering a question that is common when you're dealing with development. We're going to be answering the question of what is a REST API. So if you're doing back-end development, you're building out services and or you're working on the front end and you're trying to talk to something in the back end. You're trying to grab data from the server. The common way of doing that nowadays is through what's called a REST API. So hopefully this video will give you a high-level overview. Doesn't matter what language you're using, you can understand how this communication happens between the server and the client that you're writing. Okay? So to start this conversation, we have to break it down in smaller pieces. The first question we're going to ask is, what is an API? When we say API, we mean an application programming interface, and that's a really fancy way of basically saying it's a set of rules that allow two programs to talk to each other. In our case, with a REST API, we're talking between a client program and a server program. So those two applications have a negotiated way to talk to each other, and that's what the API is. So www is a common thing that we'll talk about when we're talking about APIs and talking over the internet. We're talking about the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web might sound intimidating, but what it really is a whole bunch of network connected machines. All of these machines are out there running. Your laptop, your desktop, a server sitting in a server farm somewhere. All of these machines can be connected to the internet. And the internet are just a series of cables that connect all of these devices together, okay? That's what we talk about when we say the World Wide Web. So what's a server? Well, a server is actually an application running on a machine that listens for messages over the network and sends responses back out, okay? So when we say the word server, that's all we mean. It's a program that's sitting there listening over the network connection for any messages coming into it and sending responses to those messages. And when we talk about local server, we're talking about an application running on your local machine, listening over what's called a local host port. So listening over the network, but internally only. Okay, so that when we say we're working with a local server, that's what we're doing. We're running the server application on our local machine, not talking out to the rest of the world. Okay, another common thing that we'll talk about as we move through this is the URI. This is the Uniform Resource Identifier. Okay, another thing we'll talk about are URLs, which are Uniform Resource Locations. So the URI is the actual resource we're trying to address. We're saying I need to execute this particular piece of code on the server. So I use a URI to identify that. The URL is what server is this located on, okay? And the URL usually includes a URI in it. So as an example, if we want to reach into a server and we want to say, give me user ABC123, then we can use a combination of the URL, which will include the address. It'll include the protocol that we're talking, and then it will include on the end the URI, which in this case would be /users/ABC123. Okay. And finally, the client. When we talk about clients, we're talking about the application making a request to the server. In modern day clients, a lot of the times that's a browser running a web page. And the JavaScript executing on the web page is running inside of the client application and is the thing making the request out to the server. But we can also be talking about mobile apps. So if you're running a native mobile app on your Android or iOS device, that is a client. If you're running an actual desktop application, something running on your machine as a native installed program, that is also a client. There's a lot of other examples, but that just gives you a high-level overview. So what is REST? REST stands for Representational State Transfer. Okay, that's a really fancy name, and the reason it's so fancy is because it was actually defined in a PhD thesis. So the name sounds way more complicated than what we're actually talking about. What we mean when we say representational state transfer is a set of rules that determine the shape of the API. And if you recall, the API is just a set of rules to determine how two applications talk to each other. So REST are the rules around what that communication looks like. That's all it is. Okay. So we're here talking about resources. We've mentioned resources in APIs, and here we're dealing with resources in REST. Resource is a piece of data, also known as state in the representational state transfer, that you can get and manipulate from the server. Okay? That's it. That's all the resources are when we talk about those. Now, those set of rules that are actually used in REST are called CRUD operations. That stands for create, read, update, and delete. And hopefully those are pretty straightforward and explanatory. When we're dealing with a piece of state or a resource, we can create new resources, we can read existing resources, we can update an existing resource, and we can delete the resource from the server. That's it. Those are the operations that we perform on it. So this is a really high level. There's a lot more in the spec if you want to dig into it, but this is a pretty high level, easy way to understand what REST means. Okay. So when we're dealing with REST by itself doesn't allow us to actually have the communication between the client and server. All it is the series of rules around how those two things can talk, but how they actually talk is through what's a mechanism called HTTP. So what is HTTP? HTTP stands for the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is the actual client-server protocol that allows the fetching of any resource from a server to a client. Okay, and when we say resources here, we do mean REST resources, but we also mean other resources such as HTML documents, JavaScript documents, cascading style sheets, images, anything that can be stored on the server. We can make a request over HTTP to fetch that and bring it back. There are other protocols. There are protocols such as FTP or UTP or any of these other protocols exist out there, but the primary one that's used on the internet when we're dealing with full stack applications is HTTP. So that's what we're going to talk about here. All right, so HTTP is made up of a request and a response. And inside of those, when we make the request, we use one of the standard HTTP methods. So we can say, I want to get data. I want to post data out to the server. And I want to put data to the server. I want to delete data. And then there's three others that are far less common when we're dealing with building APIs: head, options, and patch. We won't dig into details on those. The important ones are the first four. So get, post, put, delete. Now, you do not have to follow these rules, but as a general guideline, gets are used for reads in the CRUD model. A post is used for creates in the CRUD model. Put is used for updates, and delete is used for delete. So we can map the four HTTP methods to our four CRUD operations that we want to perform in a REST API. And that's usually the way those are laid out. They can change if you need to, but that's how we do it. Okay, so what do these requests actually look like? So here is the anatomy of a request. We have four main pieces of every request. First, we have the endpoint. This is the URI that we're using. So api.example.com/path. And then we also have optional query parameters. So if we need to pass additional information into the request, we can use the question mark followed by a name value pair. So name param equals value something. Okay. So we can pass any data that we need to get to the server. We can pass through the query parameters here. We can also pass them through the body, which I'll get to in just a moment. But one way to pass data between the client and server is through query parameters. Then, as part of the request, we also have the method. Which HTTP method are we actually using? We have to include that, otherwise the server will reject the request. So typically, as I said, we use the first four of those methods on most requests that we're making. We do gets, posts, puts, deletes. And so we just include that with our request. Then we have the headers. And headers are interesting. They are used to provide information to both the client and the server. So they can be used to pass information in both directions. That's higher level information than the actual resource that we're working with. They're contained within property value pairs. So for instance, 3 examples of very common headers are the content type. Are we looking for JSON data? Are we looking for text data? What kind of data are we dealing with? And you can pass custom content types in through here, but there are some predefined ones that we can use as well. Another header type that is very common is the authentication header. This is how we pass credentials. So we can pass username and password through this using a basic authentication header. We can use what are called bearer tokens if we're dealing with protocols like OAuth, which is a very specific protocol for setting up authentication. So whatever data we need to pass, we can pass through the authentication header for our tokens or our username and password. Anything like that can go in there. And the way that HTTP is set up is that headers are extensible. We can add custom headers on either side, on the client or the server side. So we can pass additional information into the request or into the response being sent back using custom headers of whatever name we feel like giving them. The final piece of a request is the body. So the body is the thing that contains the actual data or information you want to send out to the server. So if you're sending a JSON blob, for instance, you want to send a piece of data that contains name value pairs or nested objects or anything like that, you can send it in JSON format. You can also send raw text. So if you want to send a string up to the server, you can do that. You can send key value pairs, which is the way that most forms are submitted back to a server, is as a name value pair separated by ampersands. You can also send raw binary data or images or anything that you need to get to the server, you can include in the body. Okay, there's a lot of different data types that you can include in there. All right, and the last piece that we're going to talk about is the anatomy of the response itself. So when a response comes back from the server on the client side, we're expecting to see first the status code. Okay, the status code tells us what happened when we made our request. If our status code is in the 200 to 299 range, that means that we successfully made the request that we were making. Okay, and what number it is in that range determines the results of the success. So a 200 is just everything is okay. That's all 200 means. Something like a 204, for instance, means I created a new resource for you and it's in the database now. Okay, and so those numbers are predefined. We can go into the list of all the status HTTP status codes and pull those out and figure out what they are. If the response comes back and it has a 300 to 399, that means we redirected you to another resource. Okay, and it could be everything is okay, we just wanted you to go over here, or a temporary redirect, or a permanent redirect. This resource has moved and changed names permanently to a new location. Anything like that is encapsulated in this status code range. Then we have 400s, the 400 to 499 range. That's an error originating on the client side. So traditionally, this means things like you included query parameters that were incorrect. You asked us for text or you sent us something saying, I want text, and we don't support that. We only support JSON. Or I sent you an authentication header that was invalid. I was not actually logged in. I sent you an old one and it's expired. Those are the kinds of errors that you'll get back in the 400 range. You can also get the 404, which is I can't find what you're looking for. Okay? And finally, we have the 500 to 599 range of status codes. Those are errors that happen on the server side. Things like server's too busy, or an error has happened, a stack trace has occurred on the server side, and I can't serve your request. Or I'm out of memory. Anything like that can come in the 500 range. Then on the response, we have our headers as well. We can get the content type back from the server. If we request JSON and they send back some other format, they'll include that in the content type. That'll allow us on the client side to be able to interpret that and figure out what the actual data is being returned to us as. We can also send back authentication headers. So if we request with username and password, we could get back a bearer token so that we know we have the rights to access additional resources on the server if we pass along that bearer token back to the server. So the server knows who we are. We are who we say we are. And the custom headers. So we can set our own custom headers on the server side and send those back to the client so that they have any additional high-level information they need to know. And finally, the body of the response. This is data that the client requested and we want to send back to them from the server side. Typically, that includes HTML blocks. So if a request has come in for us to render a page and we render it, we can send that rendered text back in the body, and the browser knows how to take that HTML and turn it into what we know of as a web page. Okay. We can also include raw data in the form of JSON or binary or images or JavaScript files or whatever needs to come back, that will come back in the body. Okay, so when we're talking about REST APIs, then we put all of these pieces together, and now we have a way for us from the client to request a very specific resource from the server and then get back a response with the data that we're requesting, either changed or just returned to us as is. So this is what we talk about when we say we're building a REST API. That's the high-level overview. In future tutorials, we're going to dig into building a REST API using specific languages, but for now, this is all you need to know. I hope you join us for one of our future tutorials. Check out the channel. If you liked what you saw here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit that like button so that YouTube knows how much you enjoyed what you saw today. Thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thank you.